Hello, I'm Nick Offerman, white male translator for Gaslit Nation. To sum up this week's episode, kleptocracy anywhere is kleptocracy everywhere, and this is a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. Thanks for listening.
That's what you're telling all women in America, that they don't matter. They should just keep it to themselves, because if they have told the truth, you're just gonna help that man to power anyway. That's what you're telling all of these women. That's what you're telling me right now. Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're telling me that my assault doesn't matter, that what happened to me doesn't matter, and that you're gonna let people who do these things into power. That's what you're telling me when you vote for him. Don't look away from me. Look at me and tell me that it doesn't matter what happened to me. That you'll let people like that go into the highest court of the land and tell everyone what they can do to their bodies.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kenzior. I'm a journalist and scholar of authoritarian states with a focus on the former Soviet Union.
I'm Andrea, a writer, filmmaker, and activist, and we are going to do this entire episode snarling like Brett Kavanaugh.
Yes, we're going to, scream incoherently and rant and talk about beer and vow our revenge, and men will just line up to praise us and to defend us, and it'll be like the political authoritarian version of Beyonce's "If I Were a Boy," but yeah, not so much. So welcome to this very special episode of Gaslit Nation, which is going to concern the Kavanaugh hearings and all of the horrible interrelated things. If you're new to Gaslit Nation, we're a podcast that covers corruption in the Trump administration as well as rising authoritarianism throughout the U.S. This is a big week for that. This episode is basically our Death of Checks and Balances episode, part of a continuing theme. We started this show because one of our main concerns throughout 2016 was that the election of Trump would ultimately lead to America becoming an authoritarian state. This concern of ours was dismissed as alarmist at the time, despite evidence ranging from the obvious lessons of history, with Trump mirroring demagogues both in the US and abroad, to the transnational alliance of dictators and oligarchs and white supremacists backing Trump and using new technology to rig elections around the world, to the growing extremism and lawlessness of the Republican Party, a party which now overtly seeks one-party rule, which is perhaps best exemplified before the election by the refusal to hold hearings for Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland, and to the already weakened conditions of America's political and economic institutions, which left the country ripe for a hostile takeover. Since Trump was elected, Andrea and I have been asked over and over how we know whether America has become an authoritarian state, or how close it is to becoming one. Well, obviously we're not an authoritarian state, or we wouldn't be able to have this conversation on a podcast. But progress towards authoritarianism can be difficult to quantify, since there are so many variables. But the main thing you need to do, in this case, is look at checks and balances. So let's review that. We have the executive branch, which is, of course, dominated by Trump and his lackeys. We have the legislature, which should act as a check on Trump, but is dominated by a corrupt and lawless GOP, effectively neutering Democratic opposition. We have the judiciary, which has been the strongest bulwark against unconstitutional policies. You may remember a number of executive orders struck down as unconstitutional during Trump's first year. But this is now changing. Trump is packing the courts with unqualified, ultra-conservative judges given lifetime appointments. The most powerful of these appointments is, of course, the Supreme Court. And that's one of the reasons we're spending most of the show talking about Brett Kavanaugh. Other checks on executive power and abuse of executive power include the media, which, like the judiciary, is now failing in its obligation to act as a check on power and inform the people of the United States of corruption. Unlike the judicial system, however, this betrayal seems voluntary, and later in the show we're going to go into some, I would say unprecedented abuses of power within mainstream publications, in particular the New York Times, acting as a propaganda arm of the White House. I don't know another way to put it. And then finally, You have the check or the purported check of the intelligence services and agencies that handle matters of criminal justice, like the FBI, which are particularly important given Trump's own criminal acts and his associations with organized crime. We know that the FBI seemed somewhat compromised before the election. I would regard this as more an internal division than as some sort of sweeping force. We remember the bizarre behavior of Comey. We know of Trump and Giuliani's alleged sway over the New York FBI. Trump has threatened FBI officials and threatened to weaponize FBI documents, while Christopher Wray and other top FBI officials have said nothing and let it happen. This is both bad on its own and a fairly dire indicator for the Mueller probe, its ability to continue, and its effectiveness. And so what are we left with? Well, we're left with ourselves. Citizens are now the greatest check on the Trump administration, and the fate of the country to a large extent will be determined by the midterm elections. So we'll be discussing the ramifications of that as well. But to sum it up, this has been a historic week. It's been a historic, hellish week, particularly for women, but also for democracy itself, that may well be remembered in hindsight as a definitive moment in the death of American democracy.
What is the strongest memory you have? Strongest memory of the incident, something that you cannot forget. Take whatever time you need.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense.
You've never forgotten that laughter. You've never forgotten them laughing at you.
They were laughing with each other.
And you were the object of the laughter?
I was, underneath one of them while the two laughed. Two friends having a really good time with one another.
So, Andrea, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah? Doing good?
Not at all. So basically, Sarah and I have been on the phone for the last 2 hours or so, just coming up with like every single delay or excuse to push back recording the podcast, because this one is just... We're taking one for the team on this one. It's just, all of us have known Brett Kavanaugh's growing up in the workplace, and it's just, this is not, like, no one should be subjected to a Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It's just, you want to know something hilarious? Do you remember when people, so-called credible experts, kept saying that the GOP Congress will hold Trump, they'll check Trump? Do you remember that? That was
yeah.
Just, I was...
I'm sorry. This is like
right?
the laughter of rage. The laughter.
I have that in writing from some experts who were like, oh, don't worry, that Congress is going to hold him in check. Yeah.
It's up there at the presidential pivot, checks and balances. He'll grow into the role. And even over the last couple weeks, there have been, these same legal experts that emerge from the same DC culture, which is a swamp. That's the one thing that Trump has correct. However, he's the ultimate swamp creature. But, they were insisting Kavanaugh will probably withdraw, or this can't go forward, or the GOP will check him, or the FBI will do its job. And I've always said, there's a difference between expecting autocracy and accepting it. And I still hold true to that we should not accept it. But I think that these expectations of institutional norms and of people competently and honorably doing their job, trust has to be earned. And I don't see any reason to bestow, certain entities in our political body with our trust, in particular, obviously, the GOP. So yeah, this is a tough show for us to do. It's one thing to talk about, authoritarianism, although we both have personal experiences with that. But rape culture, is another thing. It's a tougher call. And I think also maybe you can comment on this more, Andrea, but the misogyny of the moment, the fact that the questioning of Ford's credibility, of the other accusers' credibility, There's the implication of a blanket questioning of credibility for all women. We are on the defensive despite having done nothing wrong, and have our words just innately doubted because of our gender. And, and this is something that's always been true, but it feels particularly sharp now. It feels sharp like, a razor blade getting pushed into your heart, sharp like Occam's razor slitting your throat. I don't know. You may have some commentary on that.
Yeah, I went to the driving range this weekend and I hit 129 golf balls with a driver. And I just slammed into that thing over and over and over again. And I did it all for Lindsey Graham. Actually, when I was thinking about Ivanka Trump, that's when my ball actually went the farthest. I think, remember Ivanka Trump, the moderating daughter, who is an official advisor to the President of the United States, and she's absolutely complicit in all of this. And it's so funny because I put that on Twitter that I raged at Chelsea Piers at the driving range, and I tagged Lindsey Graham in that, and Chelsea Piers retweeted it. I don't know if they realized or they picked up on it, but thank you for doing that. So what makes this show so hard for us, and what makes just reporting in the Trump age incredibly difficult, especially for survivors, is, as women, Sarah and I, we don't like to be the token woman on the foreign policy panel. As a filmmaker, no woman wants to be in the category of and here are the Academy Awards for the best film directed by a woman. Women don't like to be ghettoized. We all grow up admiring pretty much the same filmmakers, the same films. We all grow up as journalists reading and idealizing some of the great journalists of our time. And so we don't like to be stuffed into a certain category just because of our gender and having that limited role. And for our podcast, for instance, yes, we launched it with Dame Magazine, and we appreciate all their support there. And we did it because we knew those women would take us seriously from the get-go, and they did. And it was very just easy to do through them. But ultimately, this is not a show about two women. It's a show about geopolitics. It's a show about democracy in America. We almost called the podcast Democracy in America. And so what's really hard is that when you have a rapist in the White House, remember Ivana Trump said that when they were married, Trump raped her. When you have a rapist who is accused by dozens of women for alleged sexual assault, you're forced to put your gender there front and center. You're forced to pull from your own expertise of being essentially treated like a second-class citizen in America, of being essentially invisible, which is largely why a lot of our warnings on Trump and Russia very early on weren't taken seriously. And it's just this being forced to relive what was done to you. Your experience, your own Kavanaugh in your closet, and having to take him out and face him by doing a show like this, by talking about it openly. And what's really chilling is that I think people think that we're being extreme or playing the gender card, or this is all politicized. But the reality is that the reaction I'm seeing from a lot of white males of privilege, that's extreme. The paranoia that I'm hearing from people that I know even, that, what if they come after me one day for something some woman imagines I did to her 10, 20 years ago? This isn't a witch hunt by any means. Brett Kavanaugh is an extreme case. He tried to rape a woman. He's accused of gang rape. There's multiple witnesses that he shoved his penis in a woman's face at a party. This is a pattern of abusive behavior. And somebody like this, who just absolutely broke down, foaming at the mouth, screaming about a wide-ranging conspiracy against him, driven by the Clintons. This is somebody that is he belongs on Fox News. He doesn't belong on the Supreme Court. He's just so extreme and polarizing. And that stupid speech that Trump gave on election night, another said that, he's going to unify the country. That was the most presidential speech. He's going to be such a unifying force. This is as low as you could get as a Supreme Court pick. And Trump is very much doing it as, treating Brett Kavanaugh as his own human shield by having a rapist on the Supreme Court that normalizes Trump's own history of sexual assault, by having somebody that lacks such morals. You know that Kavanaugh's going to be protecting Trump and his family should a major decision in the Trump-Russia investigation go to the Supreme Court. So this is all about Trump putting Trump before country. And this is all about the Republican Congress, for whatever reason, putting Trump before country. It's not even their own party. The Republicans have shown they don't care about their party. They're letting it die. They're letting it be held hostage, this total narcissist. And I just can't think of a lower moment in that we've had in recent U.S. history than this. And for any male out there, especially white male privilege, listening and thinking, well, I think some of this Me Too movement has gone too far. You have, where does it end? Can I hug a woman now at work, or et cetera? We just don't want somebody as disgraceful and with a history of clear abuse of power on the Supreme Court. It's a very simple, basic demand. There's nothing extreme about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is frustrating to hear those criticisms because, like you said, Kavanaugh is an extreme case. There's a difference between making a sexist remark, or a crude gesture and, trying to rape someone, dragging someone into a bedroom and blaring music and locking the door and laughing about it. And, as that person flees, like I would say, the vast majority of men have not done that. And other women are not accusing men of doing that. So it's concerning to me that so many are reacting as if they are in his shoes, as if they can be, Kavanaugh and relate to him. There are a lot of things that he's been accused of. But the hearing was about Christine Ford. And, I don't think that there's been anybody who has come forth and said that she's not a credible person and that she's not a credible witness. There was one little attempt, again, by the New York Times, who during the hearing tried to have a Twitter poll whether people found her credible. And everyone was so, revolted by that they had to remove it.
That was so bizarre.
Yeah.
That was really weird. Like James Bennett's opinion section in the New York Times never misses an opportunity to embarrass itself. It's
and an
just,
opportunity for just such extreme callousness. Like last show, we were talking about their use of the phrase peaceful ethnic cleansing. Like it is such cruelty. It's so callous. It's so irresponsible. But at the same time, people found her to be credible. And what the issue that's happening here is that even those who do believe her and who do find her credible, they don't care. They just don't care. It's worth it to push this monster through anyway. And the part of her testimony, which I can't get out of my mind, is when she talked about how, when Kavanaugh and his friend Mark Judge, were attempting to rape her, the uproarious laughter between the two, because that's the kind of political culture that we're dealing with, is a culture of people who find this funny. It's such venality. It's so spiteful. It's so, I don't know. I'm having trouble talking about it.
It's the locker room talk on like the most prestigious spaces in our country, like the Supreme Court. And I do think if there's anything that, and I will repeat this over and over again, I think one of the most important things to come out of all of this shared trauma we're forced to undergo yet again as a nation under Trump, is the importance of educating people about the long-term impact of sexual assault. And that's really what is very much also at the center of this, is educating people about that. Because I one of the stupid, ignorant criticisms I've heard is, well, why would she come forward all these years later? And that's because it never goes away. It's something you live with. And I want to read from the Globe and Mail, Zosha Bilski. She wrote a piece about this enduring effect of sexual assault. And it goes, the immense personal costs are hinted at in the pivotal New York Magazine profile of Noreen Malone and Amanda Demi, of 35 women who allege comedian Bill Cosby drugged and sexually assaulted them over 4 decades. The women spoke of pained self-recrimination, shattered self-esteem, and inability to form real relationships with partners, depression and substance abuse. One woman described the after effects as a, quote, secret tumor. Trauma for victims of sexual assault is individual and unpredictable, the symptoms appearing in pulses over the years. Directly after an attack, there's often shock and visceral fear. Particularly when a victim knows the rapist, there can be guilt and self-doubt. Another layer to contend with is the physical trauma, which can include injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, and pregnancy. The emotional damage can take a longer time to emerge and can include anxiety, long-term insomnia, a sense of alienation, and thoughts of suicide. While some women get hypervigilant, others start taking risks. Especially if women experience victim blaming, the assault can leave them feeling worthless and turn into harmful coping strategies. A 2015 meta-analysis found that trauma causes neural changes and has a measurable and enduring effect on brain function, including regions involved in emotional regulation. For victims of sexual violence, trauma can live in the body as a chronic condition. So Dr. Ford was a child. She was in high school when this happened. The human brain doesn't stop, really the rational part of a person's brain doesn't fully develop until the age of 25. So this was done to her when she was still a child. And so, of course, she's going to have a vivid memory of some moments of this trauma. And experts on sexual assault, neuroscientists have confirmed to outlets like the LA Times did a great piece on this, like interviewing various experts who examined her testimony, that this is all normal. She checks all the boxes of a trauma survivor. So when you commit sexual assault, when you objectify somebody just for like a rush of pleasure, a rush of power, or whatever release of anger, whatever demented reason there is for doing something like that, where you shatter a person's inner sense of self, an agency, it's like that you're marking them for life. And that's really the conversation that parents should be having with their children, both boys and girls, and just so they understand that this is very serious. If this should happen to you, or you should do this to someone, you should and if this should happen to you, absolutely have no shame and immediately seek help. Because studies have also pointed to the fact that when a victim does come forward and seek help, however he or she is received by that first person can really deepen the damage. So that first critical moment of reaching out is absolutely critical. And so I think what we need further to come out of this is increased education.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought all that up. This is hard to talk about. It's probably
tough. This is hell. Sarah and I are in hell right now. This is the hell
and
episode.
Honestly,
we thought we were gonna do like a Halloween themed episode, but this is it. It's early. Halloween's early.
And
this
part
year.
of me feels like I shouldn't let people hear me sound like this, because people, they're not accustomed to it. Even people I know aren't used to hearing me sound like this, because there's that obligation, to be strong and be persistent and all those things.
You should start losing your shit like Kavanaugh.
I should.
Start foaming at the mouth, like gurgling beer.
I should.
Just spit beer.
But
into
I feel like people need to know. I don't know. They need to know a lot of things, most of which you just specified when you were reading that quote. But I think people do need to know that it does change you forever. And that, what women or anyone, men too, who are sexually assaulted are left with is only the prospect of going forward. You lose a part of yourself when that happens, and it's gone. You become a different person. And so, all you can do is try to move on with your life. And as Andrea mentioned, you often don't fully understand it for years, because you're actively suppressing that memory. And one of the things that was so shattering about watching Ford's testimony and also reading articles about her is that she tried so hard, to move in every sense, physically, and in terms of her self-identification and everything in her life, to move away from this horror and this trauma. She moved across the country. She kind of reinvented herself, and this is a typical thing. And then she is forced back into that place. She's forced back into that bedroom, and then, has to relive that trauma on a national stage. There is absolutely no woman who would want to go through the hell of what she's going through right now. There's no one who would want to go through that on a private level, but to have to do it publicly and to have to, be subject to this inquisition, to this unrelenting hostility and to the sense that you're nothing as a human being. You're nothing more than an obstacle for a privileged, entitled man to get what he wants, and he tried to get what he wanted 35 years ago, and now he's still going, and there's been no repercussions, and there's been no justice. And now he will become the arbiter of justice if he does ascend to this position of power. I can't imagine a more horrifying situation than that. And so, I'm grateful to her. People, I think ultimately there may be some sense of, it didn't matter if he gets confirmed. And at this point, I do think he will be, despite all of this evidence. But it does matter. It mattered when Anita Hill spoke out. It matters when Christine Ford speaks out.
All of us are a lot more powerful than we realize. And no one can take that power from you except for yourself. Like, that's it. And don't forget that.
Drinking is one thing, but the concern is about truthfulness. And in your written testimony, you said sometimes you had too many drinks. Was there ever a time when you drank so much that you couldn't remember what happened or part of what happened the night before?
No, I remember what happened, and I think you've probably had beers, Senator, and so
you're saying there's never been a case where you drank so much that you didn't remember what happened the night before or part of what happened?
You're asking about, blackout. I don't know. Have you?
Could you answer the question, Judge? That's not happened. Is that your answer?
Yeah, and I'm curious if you have.
It's just dehumanizing. All of it is so dehumanizing. You have Rachel Mitchell, a career prosecutor from Arizona, who the GOP senators hid behind to do this, this questioning of Dr. Ford as though Dr. Ford was on trial. It was victim shaming. There's no other way to describe it but victim shaming.
Yeah. And they didn't even let her do her full job. I mean, she was moving toward a conclusion, and this is sort of interesting. Like, he brought out those calendars as a form of proof of his innocence, which at the time, it just seemed like a ridiculous last-ditch kind of move. I kind of wondered, did he buy them on eBay and then fill them out retrospectively? I kept thinking, if we actually had a legitimate investigation of this, they should be doing forensics of when these entries were written in. But she seemed to be kind of leading up, to a July 1982 date as a probable date of the attempted rape, and then was taken off the stage so that, rage-filled delusional men like Lindsey Graham could sidle up to Kavanaugh and kiss his ass instead. I mean, it was just a farce of a hearing, a shame on our country. I don't know. I mean, there's so many things going on in this situation that I'm not quite sure, where to proceed.
There was a letter that Rachel Mitchell wrote where she was basically telling the GOP that Dr. Ford has a very weak case. And so it just shows that, again, this prosecutor is brought in to politicize the whole thing. She basically wrote what amounts to a strategy memo for how the GOP can work towards further trying to discredit Dr. Ford. Meanwhile, you have a lot of people across the media, men and women, sharing their own survivor stories, and you have experts weighing in and just full on supporting Dr. Ford's traumatic testimony, really validating her. Like, she checks all the boxes of somebody that survived a trauma. And just for people who just want the basic facts of, maybe you've no problem with this. Maybe you think, boys will be boys. And if that's fine, okay, that's your position. Well, think about this. Brett Kavanaugh lied about making disparaging references to teenage girls in his high school yearbook. Like, he lied about this when he was before Congress. He lied when he tried to minimize his history of heavy drinking. He certainly lied when he denied having access to files that were obviously stolen from the Democratic senators when he worked in the Bush White House. So it's the lying. It's the lying when he's going before Congress. It's just that alone. If you're somebody that is attempting to be on the highest court in the land, the higher power that all cases eventually go up to when the big heavy cases that really shape our country for generations to come, you absolutely cannot lie to Congress. So that alone disqualifies you. So
Yeah.
for all the misogynists out there, and for everybody that has to go home to Thanksgiving to a table full of misogynists, just simply, get your armor on and just point it out that he lied several times to Congress, and that alone is disqualifying.
Yeah, and it's important to note here, when you talk about rape, the common perception or misperception for decades is that, rape is an act of sex. Rape is an act of power, and lying in this case is an act of power. And lying in an autocracy is traditionally a way to flaunt power. It's to make people, the general population, feel powerless. And I think in this case, you have a man, an accused attempted rapist, lying blatantly and making women feel powerless. And I think it's that combined effect that may be hitting people so hard. But there are so many things wrong with Kavanaugh. Even before we heard about, the Ford case and that attempted rape, we were dealing with somebody who had a record of debt, of gambling, of drunkenness, of probable perjury. Somebody who had been basically operating as a GOP operative in a robe for his entire career. Somebody incapable of being objective. We had this preemptive PR blitz, where they brought out the team of 15-year-old girls, just like Ford, who he coached to sit behind him in the hearing. We had the 65 women overnight who could vouch for his character. We had this kind of constant drumbeat of wholesomeness because they knew what a degraded, horrible, vicious person lay underneath that facade. And they were trying so hard to set the stage so that it would seem unbelievable, that if any of the people who he's behaved in such an atrocious way around came forward, they would not be seen as credible. And I think it's safe to say that facade has now completely gone away through him, through his own testimony, where he was belligerent and hostile and crazed and just absolutely out of control. And that, again, is a flaunting of power. He was saying to the Senate, both GOP and Democrat alike, that he is above them, that he doesn't need to follow the law, that he doesn't need to follow protocol, that he doesn't need to follow or have basic human decency. I think this was most apparent when he was talking to Amy Klobuchar about whether she also was blackout drunk. And she, of course, her father, I think, was an alcoholic. So it was meant as a hurtful, petty slight. But yeah, there are so many things that need to be investigated about him. I think while people are focused on the sexual assault issue, they should still continue to follow the money trail, because I found that alarming. The $200,000 in baseball tickets, the country club fee of, I think it was $92,000, the mega mansion, all on a judge's salary, I think of about $200,000 a year. There are a lot of questions to be asked about who is funding him, who is grooming him, and I guess why. Although I think the why at this point is to show their power, to inflict maximum trauma. They could easily trade this guy out. It's not hard to find a right-wing extremist who wants to be on the Supreme Court. They could get another candidate, and at this point, they should, but they don't want to. And I think it's because having that blatant liar, the judge who's above the law, is an assault on democracy itself, and it's a showing that the GOP, is openly moving to becoming a one-party state, and now isn't even keeping up the pretense of being anything other than that. The monster's out. The monster of Kavanaugh is out. The monster of the GOP is out, and they don't mind if we see it because they're so confident that they will win.
And Trump's Republican Party is turning the Supreme Court into a kleptocracy court. And that's so obvious with this big, mysterious debt that was paid off of Kavanaugh's and where that money came from. And it's really like, follow the kleptocracy. Like that needs to be a central story. That's where the FBI investigation should really go as well. And it's chilling. It's a chilling reminder of the sharp far-right turn America has taken, that the White House can, yes, order an FBI investigation for show, but then limit that FBI investigation. And what is the FBI supposed to do when that agency is holding on for dear life, trying to avoid an acceleration of Trump's purge when they're investigating the president and his family? It's just such a catch-22. It's like, obviously they need to do a good job and really get to the bottom of who Brett Kavanaugh is, but they're handcuffed. They're limited by the president himself. And if they push those boundaries, if they do say, look, we want to uphold the rule of law here, and really, this is a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land, so we're going to really get to the bottom of this. If they do that, imagine how he's going to react. I mean, that whole stunt where he claimed that he fired Rosenstein or Rosenstein resigned. I mean, yes, that was some bizarre reality show of terror stunt that the White House did to try to distract from Kavanaugh, and everybody fell for it. And all it really ultimately did was reveal which reporters, like Jonathan Swan at Axios, is really like an easy mark for this administration, where they know they could place fake stories with him. That was convenient for us as to see who's doing the White House's bidding inadvertently. But ultimately, it's like the FBI, if they were to do the right thing here and say they risk their own jobs and the security of their own Russia investigation. So it's a really bizarre time. It just feels like the barbed wire is closing in on the rule of law right now.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing are people at all sorts of levels acting as if they are in great fear. You know, you see this, I think, within the FBI, within these, firings that have taken place in the aftermath, where we've had this long, slow motion purge, where Trump is, in a very overt way, trying to rid the FBI and intelligence agencies in general of people who would have insight into his Russian mafia ties and into his financial, criminal background. But they're not fighting back. They're not really standing up and saying, like, who the hell are you to boss us around? And, this is not your role. Like, no one is even trying to say that they are a potential check on power. I mean, the Democrats are to some extent, but they're unable to actually assert themselves just because they don't have the majority. But it is amazing. I mean, on all this talk about masculinity and toughness and, what it means to be a man, you're seeing just an utter fearfulness. And I'm not trying to equate that with, femininity or something, but it's just an interesting thing because you are seeing this, alpha male domination scheme where Trump just bosses everybody around. Trump, who is so blatantly unqualified for the position that he's in. And they cowered to him. And, I want to get back to the Rosenstein media fake out in a little bit. But, one person who I think we really see this with is Lindsey Graham. And so I think that, we should talk about what the hell happened to Lindsey Graham, back in...
Hashtag free Lindsey Graham.
Our Republican colleagues, if you vote no, you're legitimizing the most despicable thing I have seen in my time in politics. You want this seat? I hope you never get it. I hope you're on the Supreme Court. That's exactly where you should be. And I hope that the American people will see through this charade. And I wish you well, and I intend to vote for you, and I hope everybody who's fair-minded will.
I don't even know. I think Lindsey Graham's in a prison of his own making. So, I mean, part of me is thinking he may just deserve to be in there, because we don't know. Everyone remembers back in May 2016, Lindsey Graham was a Trump critic. He was one of the biggest Trump critics in the Republican Party. He tweeted, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. And I think the question of, who is we now is interesting, like the country, the GOP. Are those two things, synonymous anymore? And then, of course, after that, after Trump won, it was Lindsey Graham and John McCain who initiated the investigation into Trump's ties with Russia. Lindsey Graham said the GOP was hacked, and I personally, Lindsey Graham, was hacked by Russia, which leads to a lot of questions. And so, Graham kind of functioned as I guess a prominent Trump critic, given the extremely low standard spirit of criticism within the Republican Party, meaning he wasn't an ass-kissing lackey until late 2017, in which he made this abrupt transition into exactly that. There was a point where you could take old statements Lindsey Graham had made about Trump and just literally flip them on their head, and it corresponded to how he felt then. And I've talked about this. I've now been talking about this for basically a year, like on TV, in articles and all this stuff, because people are always asking me, what the fuck is with this guy? And I have a lot of, potential reasons that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The most mild are careerism and opportunism. Of course, you're going to see that from any politician. There's contamination because of Trump's own criminality and because the Republican Party as a whole is enmeshed in the Trump-Russia scandal, given the role of people like Michael Cohen or Rick Gates or, others in fundraising. We know that Graham himself has received money from Russian oligarchs. And then I think, what I used to think anyway was the most likely possibility were blackmail or threats. Those are two separate things, that possibly there was compromising information found in Graham's email or just in his life that can be used against him. And I want to emphasize it's not necessarily Russia that found this. This is the kind of thing Trump and his little gang of goons do all the time. They've functioned for decades, back to the Roy Cohn era, threatening people, getting into people's private life, recording them when they think no one's listening. This is just how they roll. And so, the other thing is possibly a threat either to him as an individual or to one of Graham's loved ones, which is often a very effective way of keeping a, potential dissident in line. And so I kind of leaned toward that. But now we're at this point where Graham not only is no longer a critic in any capacity of Trump, but is just revealing himself to be an absolutely monstrous human being, and incoherent and full of rage. The things that he was saying at the hearing, kind of blew my mind. And I don't know whether that rage is coming from a place of fear or whether this is just, what was lurking inside his little Southern demeanor all along. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear. This isn't in May 2016 when Graham was so outspoken against Trump. That was before any of the hacked material against the Democrats were weaponized. That was before voters got John Podesta's risotto recipe. So I don't think Lindsey Graham saw what was coming for him having been hacked. Even the timeline on how late it took for the Democratic Party to find out how extensively it had been hacked. So it's understandable that Lindsey Graham in May 2016, when he was a brave, outspoken voice in the GOP trying to stop Trump, he probably had no idea that at that point that he had been hacked, and even if he did know, he probably didn't even understand what that meant fully or what kind of details could come out and how that could humiliate him. If it's not something personal they're holding over him, if you want like sort of clues or some sort of idea of what it could possibly be, look at how the Russian hacks hurt the Democrats. Look at how destructive that was. So it was time to go off. WikiLeaks did the first big drop right before the Democratic convention in Philly, which really further drove apart Bernie's supporters and Hillary supporters, because you saw the internal workings of Debbie Wasserman Schultz and how decisions were being made in terms of the primaries. The primary was already decided for Hillary, essentially. And that really drove those two camps apart viciously. I remember being at the convention, and it was a lot of Bernie supporters treated it as a place to protest and demanding reform of how the DNC did things. And it was very tense. It was extremely tense, especially on that very first day. And that was done intentionally to inflict as much damage as possible for Trump's opposition. And then you had a lot of the vetting that was being done of the Democrats' donors, from passport information to Social Security numbers, all of that. And phone numbers were that information, that very sensitive information of their donors was leaked online. So if you sort of examine that, you can get a sense of what Lindsey Graham may be protecting in terms of what hacked material they have. Yes, it could be something, as common as you pointed out. This is a very common tactic. It could be something that could personally embarrass him or somebody that he cares about, somebody that he loves, or it could be a combination, including information he doesn't want to get out there for really top Republican financiers that could really humiliate or infuriate them. So it's clear that Lindsey Graham, through his bizarre behavior, is increasingly bizarre behavior, he's acting like somebody who's being held hostage. And I think everybody needs to really, if you have access to him in the halls of Congress, you really have to push this to him. You really have to put this front and center relentlessly, because this man has undergone a personality transformation since Trump has increased his hold of power over the U.S. government. So has really sort of shown that he's willing to purge, show that his vindictive streak, and Lindsey Graham has very much fallen in line. And why? And all reporters who have access to him, with the covering Congress, ask him, just relentlessly ask him, really start digging in, because the sooner we free him, the better our country will be.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if he's a hostage, he's acting like one with Stockholm syndrome. He's acting like somebody who realizes the game has been won, and that it's better to join than to be excluded or defeated, which is a frightening prospect. And yes, the media should be asking Graham. They should be asking a lot of people things that they're not doing, because they're too busy engaging in pointless or dishonest propaganda initiatives put out by the White House. And that's something I want to talk about, because you were bringing up what happened with the hacks in 2016 and the terrible effect they had on the Democratic Party. It was not just the hacks. And it was not just the information, it was the weaponization of that. And that weaponization was not just performed by the Trump camp, it was the media itself. It was so-called liberal mainstream outlets that participated in framing this information in a way to cause, the most chaos they could, within the Democratic Party, and to benefit Trump. And they are such dupes in this way, and I think for any kind of politician that's been hacked, I think it's the weaponization of that information much more than what the contents are that would frighten people, because there's this sense of a massive collective kind of echo chamber, especially the way media moves now, where it's, it's gutted, it's algorithmic, it's, people kind of piggybacking off each other. And, of course, the best example of this recently is the Rod Rosenstein debacle, in which, in the midst of the Kavanaugh conversation, we began hearing these reports from Axios, from the New York Times, and then just broadly across the media spectrum, that he had either resigned or been fired. And so we had basically 2 hours of total utter hell. We were like, well, that's it. They've got the court. The Mueller investigation is effectively over, at least as, there's a serious obstacle now placed in its path. And it was all total bullshit. It was just...
Oh, they're gonna want decisions in the Mueller investigation to go up to the Supreme Court, just to give it that carnival ride of legitimacy.
Oh, yeah.
Just give it a sheen of legitimacy by Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, and that's why they want him.
And protecting the Trumps.
Because they know how he'll rule in advance. They know that he doesn't think a president can be indicted. And of course, he's not going to think his little Lord and Master Donald Trump can be indicted. But yeah, in every kind of autocracy, they go through these rituals, these facades of a democratic process, whether it's a dictator being elected with, 95% of the vote because the people love him so, or some sort of, ruling that disregards all actual criminal information about somebody who's committed a crime in plain sight and exonerates them while labeling the opposition as criminals. We are already seeing things like this. And I think if the Mueller probe does reach the Supreme Court with Kavanaugh on it, we'll see more of that. But I'm really interested in how this Rosenstein story, how this narrative is being built, because we basically have had had about a month of propaganda initiatives from the White House being inserted into these outlets, in particular, the New York Times, was offered itself up as a mechanism of legitimation for, an ostensible coup. There were basically three big moves. There was the anonymous op-ed on the, quote, deep state, which we discussed in the last episode, which basically, served to validate all of Trump's paranoia, served as a prelude for a purge. I think we can be, fairly confident that the target of the purge was Rosenstein. Then we had an article about a week ago saying that Rosenstein had wanted to invoke the 25th Amendment and get rid of Trump the week that Trump fired Comey. Honestly, I think that's a totally reasonable thing to say. That was also the week that Trump invited Russian officials into the Oval Office so they could laugh about firing Comey. And, there's a wealth of information about Trump being a sociopath and otherwise mentally unfit for the office. But nonetheless, that's just my opinion. It is not by Rod Rosenstein's own words, his opinion. He denies ever saying this. There's a little bit of talk about maybe he said it in a joking way. But regardless of that, the New York Times presented it as a completely straightforward statement, the kind of statement guaranteed to inflame Trump, to make him very angry, to make Trump's fans angry, and to kind of give a pretense to fire him. And so that was the second thing. And then you get this flurry of articles saying that he's resigning or that he's getting fired, all of which are meant to make the public question Rosenstein's sincerity, his dedication, his own fitness, for the office that he inhabits. And I'm sorry, this is so convoluted and repetitive. All media outlets make mistakes. All journalists make mistakes. That's just part of life. And if you explain your actions and apologize and issue corrections, then that's excusable. That's not what's happening here. This is a pattern of disinformation. And, in previous shows, we've discussed the relationship that Trump has with the Times, which has done probably more for him than any outlet except Fox News to buffer him, to cover for him instead of covering him. And it's depressing to see this. I don't know what's coming next, but I don't like that the groundwork is being laid in this fashion.
No. And yeah, and to your earlier point, the weaponization of the hacked emails, and the media was all over that, all over that. They had no problem covering as breaking news, like the little gossipy bits in those emails that that WikiLeaks released through after being handed all that after it was stolen by the Russians, and yet they're hardly scratching the surface on answering who paid Brett Kavanaugh's gambling debt. How did he suddenly get, was it $250,000? And so that, it's like they spent more time, honestly, on John Podesta's risotto recipe than they done on, who is bankrolling, what dark money is bankrolling a possibly gambling addicted future justice on the Supreme Court. It's I know it's not as sexy and fun as gossip in emails that people never thought would ever be released, and it doesn't have that voyeuristic allure, but my God, this is a very important question that's central to all this. This really defines a man's character and who he's beholden to and who he'll be paying back once he's on the Supreme Court. And it's not sexy, but it's key to all of this and the future of our country. So that's really where I hope the cat laser pointer of excitement lands on that in a big way, and that the media finally digs into it and doesn't relent.
Right. And it's also frustrating because those debts that he incurred are traceable. If he bought $200,000 worth of baseball tickets, you can find the friends, that he says paid him back, or the people who went with him to games. These are all concrete material things. These are things that happened recently. This is all an area, we've known about this for months, that you would think reporters would go. And I wonder sometimes, about this political culture, about this DC, New York, sense of entitlement among the
social
wealthy
climbing
elites.
class.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people, don't view the administration with the existential horror that we do. They see it as a professional opportunity. They see it as something that they're remote and removed from. Somebody wrote me recently about a New York Times journalist who proudly kind of said he didn't vote in 2012 or 2016, and about that journalist's conversation with Bob Woodward, in which they kind of mocked the idea of the resistance. And then this person kind of thanked me for taking matters seriously, because if you're not a wealthy white man from a certain type of family, this is absolutely not an abstract issue. Your rights are at stake. Your ability to survive is at stake. And I would think if you have a conscience, if you have any compassion, even if you are of that privileged class, you would think people would at least feel bad about, kids snatched from their parents and put into tent camps. Like, you would think that would alarm you, and that you would want that to stop, and that you would want this country to not be that kind of country and not continue to go down this terrible road. But there are a lot of Brett Kavanaugh types among us. There's a kind of elite that seems to just float by, gets more entrenched, more removed from, ordinary people, from, what most people consider regular life. And I think that's just going to continue. That's why I worry about some of the traditional mechanisms against an autocracy, mass strikes or just sort of mass refusal. Like, they don't care. They don't care about being caught, and they've built up such wealth and such a kind of insularity that it's hard to kind of penetrate it. And that doesn't mean that we stop. It means we step things up, and we fight harder. But that insular privileged culture, we see remnants of it everywhere, and not just in these hearings. We see it in the media too, which, as I wrote about my book, has increasingly become a profession of elites, of unpaid internships, of expensive advanced degrees that weren't required a decade or two ago. And that's the intent. It's to keep out people who care. It's to keep out people who don't give a shit about social climbing and parties and, I don't know, all the crap they're doing. I don't know what it is, but it's obviously very important to them.
Right. Well, I know what they're doing, because I've met some of these people in person. But yeah, no, it's like you have a UN report saying that America's poor is becoming more poor under Trump. The UN has had to take it upon itself to shine a very serious spotlight on America's massive crisis of income inequality. You have reports on academics that are facing poverty, so they turn to sex work and sleeping in their cars. So things are getting, not only in the U.S. but around the world. It's the state of the world with income inequality, which is the devastation that this has really wrought. And then you have this media elite, the social climbers that are cloistered. Another sort of callous display of this is how so many, especially in cable news, were going on and on about, praising Dr. Ford's credibility. Like, she has this off the charts credibility. Like, they're talking about her almost like she was like a show pony in terms of her credibility. When, what if she didn't check all the boxes? I mean, there's so many reasons why victims don't come forward. And one of the reasons is, obviously the deep shame of it is very heavy, but you never feel credible enough as a survivor of this. You never feel like you are politically correct enough. And I worry about that a lot. I worry about that, especially when you have a worsening economy now under Trump, when you have this, deeper decline into poverty. I worry about people that are being forced to turn to sex work. And I think there's never been a more important issue, urgent issue. One of the most important ones that we should really start talking about in the mainstream is legalizing sex work, because that's how you're going to be protecting these men and women that are forced to turn to that. Many are. And I don't think you need to be a saint ever to step forward and say, hey, this powerful man did this to me. I know I'm a hotel maid, or I know I'm even a political operative for a Democratic campaign, so therefore I may have some political motive. Sure, go ahead and discuss that to death. But the point is, like, he did this to me. So I think that whole credibility issue just smacked of elitism. Like, here, Dr. Ford did all the right things because, she's a rich woman of privilege that had the support network. As heroic as what she did, she was absolutely superhuman. And what she did was, is going to leave a lasting impact for good in our country. And that bravery is contagious. But there's so many women that don't have that support network, who are brutally abused, who don't feel like they're going to be believed if they go to the press, or that they could even trust the police. And so that's another sort of a heartbreaking underlying thing in all this. In general, like, women and people of color shouldn't have to be perfect in order to be believed and taken seriously. I mean, the fight for equality, it's not to take away any rights and benefits of like privileged white men. It's just the simple demand to be seen as human. Kids can be kids unless those children are black. God forbid they get caught playing with a toy gun in a public park, like 12-year-old Tamir Rice. And so all of this is just like, allow humans to be humans, regardless of how they identify with their gender or the color of their skin. And people who, like, women and people of color should not have to feel like saints first before they can step forward and call out some abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I want to end the show on an extra angry note by saying, if you are as furious as we are, and you feel like all the gaslighting that the pundits were doing throughout Trump's rise to power and his first year in office, saying, oh, he'll pivot, the GOP will hold him in line, etc. If you're as furious as all of us, Gaslit Nation listeners out there, we encourage you to take your anger out in the polls on November 6th, and a really great way to do that. As we've been saying on this show in previous episodes, this is an assault on the rule of law in America. The checks and balances that are supposed to protect our democracy are quickly being chipped away at, and so the power is really down to us now. We're the last resort. We strongly encourage you, if you're listening, to take this extremely seriously. This is by far the most important election, yet again, in our lifetimes. And you have to go, please, we're begging you, go to a site like crushthemidterms.org. In a matter of seconds, make your plan on how you can help Democrats take back the House, take back the Senate. It's very simple, easy to use. I'm obsessed with this site. It's helped me get out there into the field. And once you create your plan in a matter of seconds, tweet it to us at Gaslit Nation, and we will retweet your plan, as long as you're not a neo-Nazi or a far-right stooge. We will be checking. And in 2 weeks, we're going to, on the next episode of, actually, we're going weekly now for October, aren't we? We forgot to announce
Hopefully,
that. We're going weekly.
We're trying to go weekly.
Yeah.
If you really want us to go weekly, go donate to the Patreon. And
yes, please.
Then it will be a lot easier for us to pay our production costs. But the plan is to try to go weekly. We will see how this goes.
Yeah, leading up to the midterms. So on the next episode of Gaslit Nation, we will announce a winner. So if you tweet at us at Gaslit Nation on Twitter, send us your crushthemidterms.org plan on how you plan to get back at the far right on Election Day, November 6th. We will retweet all those plans, and on the next episode, we'll choose a winner. Just spin the wheel of chance, and we'll send that winner a free copy of Sarah's New York Times bestselling book, The View from Flyover Country, signed by her. And you'll get that in the mail. And our gratitude for all people who participate. We need you. This is a very desperate time in our country. This is not a drill. It's really come to this. They're closing in. They're going to steal the Supreme Court now. And we all have to fight like our lives depend on it, because they do, on November 6th.
The Senate took a recess. Then it was time to hear from Judge Kavanaugh, and he came out with a well-coiffed head of steam.
This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons.
In conclusion, I'll be a non-biased and impartial judge, just an umpire calling balls and strikes secretly being thrown by George Soros and Hillary Clinton.
Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa.
And our editor is Carlin Daigle. Thank you, Carlin.
If you want to help us, leave a review on iTunes. Every review helps us build our audience.
And check out our Patreon if you like what we do. Thanks for listening.